each of the panelists, has there ever been a country in history that has grown at 2.5% annually in the face of productivity decline, population decline, and a prohibitive debt burden? And I'll start with Mr. Asu, and we'll go down the row.
Yeah.
Easy question.
I'm not aware of one.
Okay.
Nor am I, sir.
Not to my knowledge.
Seems unlikely.
Not aware.
So America's greatest enemy is not the CCP. America's greatest enemy is itself. It's the dysfunction of our politics. You know, there may be severe structural limits on China's ability to grow the Chinese economy, but there are no limits to America's ability to sabotage the American economy. Who needs the CCP when you have the self-sabotage of debt limit brinksmanship here in Washington, D.C.? The full faith and credit of the United States and the status of the dollar as the world's reserve currency form the foundation for American leadership in the world, the very American leadership that the Chinese Communist Party is intent on overturning. And so I have a simple yes or no question. If the federal government were to breach the debt limit beyond the X date, would damaging the full faith and credit of the United States undermine the competitive position of the United States relative to the CCP? And we'll start with Mr. Ashu.
Yes.
Yes.
I think that's likely.
Agree.
Yes.
As you know, more than 6 years ago, we saw Russia weaponize social media platforms like Facebook and Twitter to interfere with the 2016 election and otherwise conduct influence operations against the United States. The CCP has infinitely more influence over TikTok than Russia ever did over Facebook and Instagram. TikTok is or could easily metastasize into a Trojan horse for a CCP influence operation against the United States. A question to each of you, do you think TikTok should be banned from the United States?
I really can't answer it. We did look at this when I was in government, and there's clearly issues there, but the what to do about it. An outright ban may not be the answer, but clearly...
Are you aware that the parent company of TikTok has a CCP committee?
Most Chinese companies have some sort of Chinese government influence.
And is that cause for alarm?
Of course it is, absolutely.
Right.
And
as you know...
Clear. Well, I can't give you a yes, no, because I want the solution to fit the problem, and I don't have enough information.
Well, let me phrase the question differently. You know, TikTok is not only a social media platform, it has become a leading news source for the next generation of Americans, our most impressionable minds. Is it in the strategic interest of the United States to have the CCP shape the information environment of the United States?
So again, sir, this is an important issue. We did look at it when I was in government. Finding the right answer in a way that didn't run afoul of concerns such as First Amendment and other things that came up. It doesn't, just because it didn't work the first time doesn't mean we don't need an answer here. We do. I just don't know what it is, and I'm out of government, so unfortunately not.
Mr. Fetto, should we ban TikTok? And I have nothing against dancing, for the record.
So I worry about the idea of banning because it can become a slippery slope. Also, attempting to ban TikTok failed during the Trump administration with his, the president's executive order in August of 2020. I think you're right. The concerns about its parent company, the Commerce Department at the time had supporting information related to its attempt to enforce the ban, that there were 130 CCP committee members within the parent company that had been...
What was the number?
130
CCP members in the parent company.
You know, National Security Advisor O'Brien, President Trump's National Security Advisor, has called it the biggest, the worst own goal in national security and a scandal.
I think time is, I just want to quickly get yes or no answers. Mr. Lorber, Mr. Willems, Mr. Harrell.
I don't think it lends itself to just a simple yes or no.
Okay.
I think there are all sorts of factors.
I think we should put in place a broader infrastructure to examine all Chinese apps operating in the United States and make sure that we're protecting against national security threats, because I don't think it's just TikTok.
Fair enough.
Yeah, I agree with Clayton.
Great. Thank you. My time has expired.
We'll now recognize Mr. Muser, Pennsylvania, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Certainly thank all of our witnesses for all of your time here today. So China, is characterized in many different ways: a competitor, a rival, authoritarian, adversary. And I guess we'll see over the years what it will be characterized by us moving forward. But right now, the CCP, among many things, is accused of, and there is much evidence to support, the regular theft of intellectual property. So recently, FBI director stated that the Chinese government poses the biggest long-term threat to our economy and national security of the U.S., of course. He described a lawless, stop-at-nothing China government agenda to steal IP. So, Mr. Xu, in your judgment, is the Biden administration, are we treating this as seriously as we should be?
The issue of IP theft?
Yeah.
I believe so. I believe it certainly had attention in the prior administration. I haven't seen that wane. The challenge is it is a very hard problem to solve because the institutions to deal with it are in the law enforcement realm, and once that IP has been purloined, it's not like you can just disgorge it. So it's a very challenging problem.
I was in business for a long time on an international basis, and I can appreciate that, but is it something that we understand, our State Department or others are regularly commenting on and pushing back on and trying to investigate, to your knowledge?
I can't speak specifically to a particular agency. I certainly know it was a priority when I was regulating.
All right. Mr. Fetto, is the Biden administration's assault on our domestic energy industry, the excessive spending that took place over the last several years, which is the primary cause of inflation, higher interest rates, loss of much wealth in the capital markets, along with raising of business taxes, which has been done, and a lot of talk of raising taxes further higher in the near term on U.S. companies. Does this improve our position vis-a-vis China? And does it improve the economic competitiveness of the United States, in your view?
I don't think it does. I'm probably not the best to answer with more precision. If I can just interject on your question to Mr. Ashew, I do think the FBI Director Wray is constantly talking about intellectual property theft, and the FBI, he has said, is opening up an investigation related to espionage and IP theft every 12 hours, and there are over 2,000 investigations. So I do think the Justice Department is very focused on that issue.
Mr. Lauber, do you think the idea of raising our corporate income tax from 21%, which it was lowered to, as we know, which has made us competitive sort of in the middle of the pack of industrialized nations, do you think the idea of raising that will help or hurt our economy vis-a-vis China's output?
I mean, I can't speak specifically to, the raising of the corporate, minimum tax, but I will say that anything that we do that hurts the competitiveness of U.S. companies would, hurt the U.S. national security vis-a-vis.
Hurt U.S., made in the U.S. makes it more difficult. Mr. Williams, your thought on that?
We should not raise the corporate tax.
Right. So something else I want to bring up. I have a bill, H.R. 839, known as the China Exchange Rate Transparency Act. And what this bill does is it requires the Treasury to instruct the U.S. Executive Director at the IMF to use the voice and vote of the United States to advocate for increased transparency from the PRC's exchange rate practices, compliance by the PRC in line with what other members of IMF are beholden to, and publication of significant divergences, and stronger consideration by the IMF management and members of the PRC's lack of transparency when evaluating quota and voting shares at the IMF. Would you just comment if you think such a bill makes sense?
So I think that this is the right approach. This is an issue the committee should be focused on. I think one thing the committee should explore in greater depth is enforcement mechanisms around these IMF proposals. What are the sources of leverage we can use to actually effectuate these policy changes? And I do think it's helpful to instruct the U.S. representative at the IMF to take these positions, but how are we actually going to get results? So I think I'd like to start with your bill, and then let's build off of it and figure out how to make it actually happen.
Great. Anybody else? We only have 8 seconds. Get a comment on that? Good. All right. Mr. Chairman, I yield back. Thank you.
Gentleman's time has expired. The gentlelady from Colorado, Ms. Pedersen, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all for being with us today. I know it's been a long one, so thanks for sticking it out. I know that we're focused on the economic threats of China, and something that isn't necessarily part of this, but I think that I want to talk about some economic tools you might recommend on how to address the threat that we face from China with the illicit drug market and the increase in fentanyl coming into our country. And this hit Colorado hard. This is happening globally. And so while I know that you are not all here today as expert in the illicit movement of drugs and drug proceeds, I just want to know if you have recommendations for economic tools, carrots and sticks that Congress might be able to employ to actually change behavior here. This is something that has killed more people in the United States than all of the world wars combined, the opioid epidemic. It's the third wave, and fentanyl has completely taken over the drug supply chain, and it is incredibly dangerous. So would love to hear your thoughts.
Sure, I'm happy to take a first cut at the response. So, as I mentioned earlier, we have seen the Treasury Department target a number of Chinese individuals and entities for their role in illicit fentanyl production and smuggling. One other approach that I have seen as a complement to sanctions authorities that's worked, I think, fairly well over the last few years has been guidance and advisories that have been promulgated either by the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network or OFAC or other entities in the U.S. government that highlight what the typologies of illicit funds movements associated with a particular threatening activity could be, in this case, fentanyl trafficking. Something along those lines, if you wanted to think about how you could expand the toolkit beyond simply sanctions and law enforcement as of right now, might be something to consider.
I appreciate that. Thank you so much. I yield back my time.
The gentlewoman yields back. The gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Fitzgerald, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Willems, one of our major priorities as a committee is to prevent malign influence by China that would distort our markets. Last Congress, I was fortunate enough to author a bill, Foreign Merger Subsidy Disclosure Act, and it was signed into law by the president. It put emphasis, I think, on just disclosure, sunshine, that type of thing. The FTC and the Department of Justice, the Antitrust Division, are now required to monitor and take foreign government subsidies into account in the pre-merger notification process. Another area where China is attempting to infiltrate are exchange trade funds traded here in the United States as well. Many of these investment vehicles contain Chinese companies involved with China's military as well. That has been disclosed. I think there was even some discussion about it today. So, for example, CSSC Holdings Limited, China's largest builder of military ships, is listed in several major investments indices, including MSCI, Emerging, FTSE as well. So there's a number of different corporations that are complicated acronyms as part of this discussion. The indices contain trillions of dollars of assets under global management. A current law that prohibits U.S. investors from buying or selling securities for companies deemed to support China's military. However, parent companies or subsidiaries of listed companies can still be found in these indices. Why is it that the parent and subsidiaries of listed companies can circumvent this ban? We still don't have a full answer on. One of the other principles I hope we keep in mind is that as we look at ways to counter China is to ensure that these policies do not weaken the dominance of the U.S. dollar here and abroad. We've seen how many of these just adversaries like China, Iran, and Russia have made efforts to reduce their reliance on the dollar. But even some of our allies have sought to work around our sanctions. We're well aware of it. And, I think it goes beyond bad actors at this point. And they're trying to establish alternatives to our SWIFT system. So my question to you would be, are there things we should be doing in addition to what we tackled in the last Congress that could probably tighten this and make it more presentable to not just congressional committees, but also to DOD and anybody else involved in the defense industry?
So first, let me say congratulations on your bill. I think it was a
thank you.
good piece of legislation and glad that it was signed into law. Second, let me comment on the military company restrictions, which you referred to. I think that Congressman Barr has legislation that's looking to make this statutory and then tighten some of the gaps. And I think that as we're doing it, considering what you raised is also a worthwhile endeavor for this committee to explore. Now, I think that there may be some complexities we need to think about when you're talking about entire index funds, but the point is, if we make a determination that a company is linked to the Chinese military, we shouldn't have U.S. investors in that company. And so we need to figure out how we are closing all applicable gaps, and I think exploring what you raised is a worthwhile endeavor. On the SWIFT question, that's less my area of expertise, but happy to try to get back to you on that, or maybe one of my colleagues also has something to say, and I was looking at Eric.
I'm happy, thanks, Queen. I'm happy to touch on the SWIFT question.
Yeah, Mr. Lorber, yeah, do you have a comment on that?
Yeah, say the second, sorry.
On the SWIFT part of it?
Yeah, definitely. So I do think that to a certain extent, as we talked about previously, there are workarounds that are under development or have been developed by our adversaries. China, we talked about with the potential CBDC, as well as Russia and the mirror payment system. On the SWIFT side, I actually think that the threat of a sort of a European defection from the U.S.-led financial rail system may not be as immediate as some were worried about even a few years ago. So remember that the Europeans set up Instex following the U.S. Withdrawal from the JCPOA as a way to facilitate trade with Iran that was outside the U.S. sanctions jurisdiction. I think there was one transaction that ended up going through Instex. Very, very few did. And so I think to a certain extent there was a lot of talk about it at the time, but in actuality it didn't come to fruition, and certainly I haven't heard of anything along those lines since the Russian invasion of Ukraine last year.
The gentleman's time has expired. The chair now recognizes the gentlewoman from Massachusetts, Ms. Presley, for 5 minutes.
Thank you. First, I just want to take a moment to condemn the anti-Asian rhetoric by many of our colleagues in Congress across the aisle, which has emboldened anti-Asian hate, not only in the Massachusetts 7th, which I represent, leaving many of my constituents in fear with their safety threatened, but really threatened our democracy, I think, writ large. And I want to just take a moment to forcefully disassociate myself from remarks made by my colleagues that peddle in xenophobia and fuel violence against the Asian community. I do think we can certainly be critical of the Chinese government and their economic policies without being hateful, racist, or xenophobic in our language. So Mr. Harrell, you are the former Senior Director for International Economics and Competitiveness with experience on the National Security Council and the National Economic Council. Do you agree that it is possible to talk about China's policies without being racist or xenophobic?
I think it is very important that we be thoughtful in how we talk about and how we discuss the challenge we face from China. It's been heartening here today with this committee to hear several members of the committee note that when we talk about our competition with China and the threat from China, we are talking about the Chinese Communist Party and the Chinese government, and we are not talking about the hundreds of millions of ordinary Chinese who we have a lot of common with at a personal level. I do think it is important that we continue to be careful about how we talk about this in a politically charged atmosphere, to make sure that we are clear that we're talking about government policies in China, the acts of the state, and that we are not inadvertently kind of sliding into statements against the Chinese people.
Thank you. I hope that my colleagues hear you loud and clear and can learn from that. I also hope they learn to discuss global competitiveness without warmongering. It is no surprise that proponents of the military-industrial complex have already seized on recent events to call for even more defense spending. War should not be the centerpiece of U.S. foreign policy, In today's hearing, let me say that war will not solve our global economic challenges. Rather, the United States can demonstrate global leadership by building partnerships grounded in just economic policies that center human rights, invest in workers, and form lasting relationships. That's how we achieve our goals on the global stage and distinguish our approach from Chinese policies. I'm particularly interested in the U.S. economic approach to the African continent. Africa is a rapidly evolving continent. In 2019, 7 of the 10 fastest growing economies in the world were in African countries, and the continent's population is expected to double to 2.5 billion people by 2050. Mr. Rell, can you describe some of the key lessons we should learn from Chinese policies and economic investments in African countries?
I think it is incredibly important that we, as the United States, up our game with respect to engagement in Africa. I think there have been a couple of very positive steps over the last couple of months. I think President Biden's African Leaders Summit provides a useful foundation to renew diplomacy and economic engagement across the continent. And I think trips like Secretary Yellen and Secretary Blinken's recent trips to the continent help build on that foundation to deepen ties. I do think that we are potentially for the Biden administration, is potentially further along in its thinking with IPEF and with APEP, initiatives for the Indo-Pacific and for the Americas Partnership, than it has been on some of the specific economic deliverables and initiatives for the African continent. But I am also confident that that is coming out of the African Leaders Summit. We're going to see more robust engagement. I do think we're well positioned for renewed engagement in Africa because the shine has really come off of the kind of Chinese debt diplomacy of the last decade in China. We are seeing countries in Africa and elsewhere, but particularly in Africa, see some of the downsides of letting Chinese companies come in with low standards for mining, for manufacturing, for the environment, for labor, and for human rights. And so you are beginning to see African governments put a pause on Chinese projects.
I'm almost at time. Thank you so much. I do strongly believe the U.S. has an opportunity to be a fair economic partner with African nations and to foster a global economy that truly works for all. Thank you.
The gentlelady's time has expired. The gentleman from New York, Mr. Garbarino, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all for being here all day today. I appreciate it. Mr. Willems, I have a question for you. The Asian Development Bank is probably the most important development institution in the Asia-Pacific region, addressing regional development problems using financing in the form of grants, loans, and advisory services. However, beginning in 2014 with the New Development Bank and in 2016 with the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, China has created its own rival banks while still itself getting loans from the Asian Development Bank. I believe China received the second most amount, accounting for 14% of the bank's outstanding loans. There have been discussions with the Asian Development Bank about possibly stopping loans to China because even though China likes to say it's a developing country, we don't think it is anymore. Do you think, but they haven't made a final decision, do you think China should still receive or should stop receiving loans from the Asian Development Bank? And what advantages does China get by continuing to receive these loans?
So thank you for the question, and I agree. I think China should not receive loans from either the World Bank or the Asian Development Bank. And I don't have it in front of me, but if you look at the World Bank's Articles of Agreement, it talks about the countries that should receive loans are those that don't have the liquidity themselves. So what you have here is China actually getting the loans instead of those who actually need it. And so I think in both of those institutions, we need to try to work with allies to create a situation where China is no longer getting loans. Because if they can do Belt and Road, if they can do the AAIB, they clearly don't need the ADB or the World Bank.
Exactly, and I love you're saying that they're taking 14% of the pot of money here that could be going to other people, and you just mentioned Belt and Road, and I guess that's been around for 2 decades or so, and I think the estimates last pegged China's lending to the development world at $1 trillion. I think it was the last estimates in the last couple of years, which would make them bigger than the World Bank and IMF. So,
And these loans, though, that they're giving out to these developing countries are usually shorter term, higher interest rates. And we're seeing now Pakistan said it wants to renegotiate Belt and Road Initiative payments, accusing Chinese companies of inflating the cost of construction by $3 billion. Beijing, Laos or Sri Lanka, and I think some other African nations have asked to restructure and delay repayments or forgive billions of dollars, because of the high interest rates and everybody coming out of the pandemic. Because of what these loans that China has done through Belt and Road Initiative, and now these developing countries are look like they're being harmed even worse than we thought they were going to be. What roles should we and other international financial institutions have in addressing the needs of these developing countries that receive funds from the Belt and Road Initiative and now are in need of debt relief?
Yeah, so two comments on this. The first is, the hypocrisy from China is thick, right? China goes around and says it's the defender of the multilateral system and it's a responsible international stakeholder, yet it's the outlier in refusing to restructure these debts. And so I do think we need to work with allies to pressure China to change its position. The second point I would make is we need to help prevent these countries from getting in that position in the first place. And one of the issues that I think we need to focus even more on is our development tools, the DFC and others, in figuring out how to provide a robust alternative to China so that these countries aren't taking Belt and Road money to begin with.
Okay, but we have to make sure, we've got to make sure that taxpayers aren't bailing out these bad loans, because...
Agree.
Okay, I just want to make sure that, so what type of pressure, because I don't know if IMF or World Bank coming in and renegotiating these loans is going to work, but so what kind of pressure can we put on Beijing to make them do it?
So I think one of the things we want to do is work with G7 partners. And, the United States alone doesn't have the voting shares in either of these institutions to be able to leverage change itself. It needs partners. And so we need to get those partners who have enough voting shares to actually make a difference. We need all of them to band together get on the same page and pressure China. And that's the best way to do it, in my opinion.
I appreciate those answers, and I'm out of time, so I yield back. Thank you very much.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Nevada, Mr. Horsford, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. I want to thank the chairman and the ranking member for holding this necessary hearing today. And I want to thank our expert witnesses for appearing before the committee. I'm glad that you're here to elaborate on the various ways that the Chinese Communist Party is challenging the United States' interest on a global scale, whether it be through unfair trade practices and ignoring of international sanctions, undermining of the SWIFT banking system, expansion of influence through the Belt and Road Initiative, or simply military aggression. We are seeing a multifaceted campaign from Beijing to catapult China to the forefront of global markets and the world stage. We have a responsibility to our children and to the next generation to own the 21st century as the United States. No longer do we have the luxury of waiting for tomorrow, as we are locked in a competition for America's global standing today. So the work that we do here and have done over the last 2 years will be key to positioning our country for the economic fight to come. I'm proud to say that House Democrats have delivered and laid the groundwork for American success through strategic investment in our people, our production, and our infrastructure. The CHIPS and Science Act ensures that the technology of the future will be made right here in America by union members with good quality jobs. And as the high-tech manufacturing sector evolves, our production capabilities will grow right along with it. However, other investments were necessary to rebuild our crumbling roads and bridges through the bipartisan infrastructure law, which will allow American businesses to bring their goods to the market faster and at a lower rate. Meanwhile, the Inflation Reduction Act delivered support to the nearly 60,000 manufactured employees back in my home state of Nevada, while ensuring that the United States will lead the way forward on clean energy. Now, these are just some of the examples, and I know my colleagues on the other side will propose additional ones, and I hope to work with many of you on those efforts. But I believe that we should be focused on also supporting and investing in American companies and the American workforce. For decades, investments, manufacturing, and our supply chains had to be offshored to China by multinational corporations that saw opportunities for ever greater returns. I am particularly worried by the large investments from the Thrift Savings Plan and other retirement accounts into companies controlled by the Chinese Communist Party. Nevadans don't need to have their retirement accounts investing their hard-earned money into companies and funds that are actively competing against us. While I applaud President Biden for his recent executive order barring investments in certain military or surveillance companies, it remains that U.S. investors hold over $1.2 trillion in equity and debt issued by Chinese entities. These investments should be made here at home to the benefit of American companies, communities, and workers. To make matters worse, while the companies American firms have invested in may appear privately held, oftentimes they are still working at the behest of the Chinese Communist Party. Mr. Harrell, given all that we know about the difficulty to disentangle Chinese state-owned enterprise from private firms, do you think it is appropriate for the administration and Congress to consider further restrictions on American investment in Chinese firms? Are we essentially shifting money away from our domestic sectors to the benefit of our competitors?
So I do think it is appropriate for Congress and for the Biden administration to look at ways to expand limits on certain U.S. investments in China. I'd recommend in particular that the administration and Congress work to build out the list of Chinese military and surveillance companies where investment is currently prohibited to potentially include other kinds of companies where we see specific national security risks from the investment in those companies. And I also joined several of my colleagues here in endorsing a narrowly targeted review mechanism for certain outbound private investments in China. I do think it's important to look at both these issues.
Thank you very much, Madam Mr. Chairman, Madam Ranking Member, I will yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The gentlewoman from California, Ms. Kim, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. I want to really thank the witnesses. You are the experts in this field, and I think it's such a timely hearing on the topic of how we discuss the economic challenges posed by CCP. As you know, it's no secret that CCP, under the authoritarian regime of Xi Jinping, they are trying to displace the United States as the #1 economy in the world and counter the American dream with the CCP's version of the China dream on the global stage. I mean, I am an immigrant who came here to live that American dream, and to see that eroding every year by CCP, I can't tolerate that, which is why, when we see CCP strategically undermining U.S. interests and threatening U.S. economic and commercial interests abroad at every turn, we got to do everything we can to come up with policies that will counter it. We just saw in the last week, CCP is not just satisfied with threatening U.S. economic and commercial interests abroad. It has also sought to violate our domestic airspace and the longstanding international norms with surveillance balloons, right? So clearly, we need to put CCP and Xi Jinping and their reckless actions tamed. So let me ask you, with Mr. Lorber, question for you. The CCP has opted to increase its bilateral swap line agreements to further internationalize its currency and rival the US dollar as the world's reserve currency. So as in the case of Russia, these bilateral swap lines are being used to circumvent the US dollars and sanctions. So can you talk about the policies that US can implement to flatten or reduce bilateral swap line agreements between CCP and other countries?
Thanks. Yeah, it's a great question. And I think there are two responses to it. The first response is, in any situation, including like this, where there is a national security threat or potential illicit activity occurring, that is a prime candidate for the use of a targeted sanction. So that definitely does exist in this scenario. I think the second point, though, is that part of the reason that it's been challenging, as I understand it, for China to internationalize many of its financial relationships and have widespread adoption of currency, is the renminbi itself has certain core limitations to it, right? So a degree of exchange rate volatility, capital controls that exist. And so I think the second point I would make is that there is always a distinct possibility, and maybe even a probability, that the expansion of these swap lines may not occur because of the limitations of the renminbi.
Thank you. Mr. Williams, I have a question for you. You know, the COVID-19 pandemic and the CCP's COVID zero policy showed that critical supply chains and international commerce cannot be subject to the whims of an authoritarian regime that disregard the basic economic norms. So can you describe any policy recommendations that will help us move the critical supply chains away from China? And as a follow-up, your thoughts on re-engaging Indo-Pacific partners, and allies with our trade agreements.
So I completely agree with your premise, and I do think that that is a lesson from the pandemic. I think that we do need to figure out, can we reduce supply chain reliance on China? Now, I think one unfortunate circumstance has been that this administration has not been pushing for the right policies to do that. And one of the things that I would like to see much more of that I think can be more effective is trade agreements. And to put it simply, if we want our companies to leave China, we need to provide them with positive incentives in other markets to go to. So we need to make it easier to link our supply chains with these other countries. And so I would like to see more trade agreements, in particular in the Indo-Pacific. Taiwan would be a top candidate for me. And then I would also look at renegotiating the TPP, trying to fix it and make it work for U.S. interests.
Great, thank you. I mean, we agree on that. I have one more question for you, Mr. Williams. I've been an advocate for the United States to provide Taiwan, the membership in the international organizations, and I've done that in the first term that I served, and just recently I introduced H.R. 540. It's the Taiwan Non-Discrimination Act to allow Taiwan to be included in the international monetary policy. So I want to get your take on that, and can you describe how getting Taiwan into IMF, for example, could strengthen the IMF and other international organizations?
So I have 5 seconds, but I will strongly endorse your bill. And I do think Taiwan's already a member of many organizations.
The gentlelady's time has expired. Please submit for the record.
I heard what I needed to hear. Thank you so much for your endorsement of my bill. I yield back.
The gentleman from Nebraska, Mr. Flood, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to all the witnesses that have been here. In 2017, the People's Republic of China announced with glee that they were going to be giving us $100 million to build a garden in our national park here in Washington, D.C. It turns out they wanted to collect intelligence. They wanted to find out what was happening in our nation's capital, and they have been doing this all over the country. As a representative from Nebraska, I represent Offutt Air Force Base, which is home to STRATCOM. We also, as many of you know, have a very close connection to our nuclear triad, and we have sensitive military assets all over the state of Nebraska. And I found out that through a company called Huawei, cell phone companies, some of them owned by American companies, are providing cellular services using Huawei equipment. On top of this, folks in North Dakota and several rural states are raising the red flag about the Chinese government purchasing real estate in the United States. My question is for Mr. Feddo. During your time working at the Treasury, can you speak to how frequently Chinese real estate purchases came under CFIUS review? Was it frequent or infrequent?
Thank you very much for the question, Mr. Flood. We implemented the rule. We had a statutory deadline of February 13th of 2020, and we implemented the regulations which made real estate jurisdiction effective at that time. Real estate filings are voluntary. They're not a mandatory filing, but the committee has the power to pull in filings that it deems deserve scrutiny under its jurisdiction. Oftentimes, real estate transaction jurisdiction overlaps with the normal jurisdiction of the committee, and so it's hard to say which ones might be real estate related transactions, but the concern about proximity, which you're describing, is something that the committee and its members, especially the member agencies, the Justice Department and the FBI in particular, are very concerned about and very alert to. So that piece is addressed. There's a list of almost 200 military installations and other facilities that are published by the committee that relate to real estate jurisdiction. So to the extent, and those are provided by the agencies within the committee that have the subject matter expertise to say, this facility is sensitive and should be within the real estate jurisdiction of the committee. And so to the extent there's a facility or an installation that's not in there, that's on the committee and its member agencies to dialogue and tweak it so that there's appropriate coverage for something that's sensitive.
It seems to me like Congress needs to take this very seriously, maybe make it mandatory that the reporting happen. And as I read the regulations now, you know, in the case of the Chinese garden, it was roughly 2.7 miles away from the U.S. Capitol, 4 miles away from the White House, yet CFIUS's jurisdiction is defined as 1 mile from the base. It seems to me like we could be making some changes in the way our statute reads so that we are requiring a better look at some of these concerns.
Maybe. I would say that the committee, the full committee and all the member agencies, including DOD and those that have a stake in this issue of proximity and spying and collection of intelligence, we're all very involved for 2 years in scoping this out. And one concern I would have, and as you consider what to do going forward, is to the extent real estate jurisdiction is scoped so broadly, it may consume everything that CFIUS does and sort of make it limitless.
And I do appreciate your concern there, because I think we can draw this in such a way that draws everybody into a circle and we could waste some government resources. Do you feel confident that CFIUS's current review process gives us the ability to police what I think a lot of folks in North Dakota and Nebraska and other communities are saying about the CCP's efforts in real estate?
I do, to the extent it's a clear national security issue related to a U.S. business or to an installation or to something that gives it a hook. If it's more of a raw real estate transaction, that may be another question for another authority within the government.
The gentleman's time has expired.
I yield back.
The gentleman from Iowa, Mr. Nunn, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you very much for the panel being here. You are all experts on China, the threat emerging from China. You know, as we look at things as a counterintelligence officer myself, who protects our national security, as somebody who's flown recon operations in international airspace, not violating other countries' sovereign airspace territory has been seen in recent days. We have a real concern here, and I think one of the greatest threats to U.S. national security in relationship to China right now is not on the battlefield, but it's in that area where a great transfer of U.S. wealth is going to build the Chinese economy, whether that's state-owned businesses, whether that is their foreign investment in infrastructure done with American credit, or whether that's the actual buildup of the People's Liberation Army. With this, Mr. Williams, you've highlighted, you know, firsthand how export controls, restrictions and subsidies received by China on the global stage are becoming a threat. One of the things I'd like to learn, first of all, before we get to a situation of a kinetic conflict between the United States and China, how can we provide an off-ramp for China to do right by the United States and themselves, as well as U.S. companies really leading in this space, to have good behavior that's going to reward America and not allow China to continue to take advantage of us?
So I think what I would start with is the need to bifurcate the kinds of activity that we have with China. On one hand, there are things that can clearly contribute to their military development, that can raise national security threats, and we need to crack down on that kind of behavior. On the other hand, we want to maintain linkages with China where we can. Right. And I think there's been a lot of conversation today about distinguishing between the PRC and the Chinese people. And it's important to maintain that distinction, and it's important for us to have our companies engaging directly with the Chinese people themselves. And I think from someone from Iowa, having more exports into China is good. It helps Iowa farmers. I also think looking at our financial services industry, they need to be on the ground in China to do business in China and to be globally competitive. So let's maintain those links while cracking down on the ones that are problematic.
Mr. Williams, I think you've hit the point head on. One of the bills that I'm looking at introducing here is neutralizing the Unfair Chinese Subsidy Act of 2023. What this really looks to do is to identify the way in which the Treasury Secretary could develop a strategic plan today and a timeline to work with our allies in order to seek China's compliance with international export subsidy standards. This goes to both a multilateral, which you've spoken to, approach with our allies, as well as a very targeted bilateral pressure towards China. So the follow-up question here, what levers would you recommend the administration utilize, maybe those levers that are not being utilized, and how could we move forward with this in a pragmatic way?
So I like where your legislation is going, and I will say I think it's part of a broader approach. And so on one hand, we do want to engage with the OECD and enforce these rules against China, and I think we should talk about how to do that, how to work with allies and partners to put that pressure on China. At the same time, we don't want to race to the bottom with China, but we do have an export credit agency, XM Bank, that can provide an alternative to what China is doing. And I've had a couple recommendations earlier today on how to loosen some of the strings around XM so we can provide a meaningful alternative. Things like having their China Transformational Exports program that cuts through red tape, things like allowing them to take a little bit greater risk to make sure that we're actually in the same level playing field as China.
Excellent. Mr. Williams, I would echo here with the chair, this can be truly a bipartisan effort, that we need to have a strategy towards China today, not a strategy that develops after an incident occurs and that we are in a reactive posture. We have the opportunity to lay out a clear roadmap here on how the U.S., China, and our allies can mutually be successful rather than locked in this long-term strategy of adversarial relationship that regretfully could end up in a kinetic situation. So with that, I would reach across the aisle to my colleagues to support what could be a bipartisan lever here on holding China accountable for their Subsidies Act. And again, I want to thank the committee for hearing from this incredible group of witnesses and your expertise in the area. With that, Mr. Chair, I yield back my time.
The gentleman yields back. The gentlewoman from Indiana, Ms. Houchin, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all for taking time to come and speak to us today, given the events occurring over the weekend, the Chinese spy balloon crossing, excuse me, the breadth of the United States with what appears to be a clear attempt to spy on our military assets. I'm really glad that this first substantive committee hearing we're discussing this important topic about the People's Republic of China, the Communist Party's, Chinese Communist Party's threat to our financial institutions and economy, but also our national security and our way of life. I have a question for Mr. Fetto. As a free market conservative, I read your testimony, and I'm particularly interested in your comments on how we can mitigate our risk while also maintaining a strong, open, free market investment environment.
Thank you for the question. What I'm focused on primarily in the written testimony is this notion of creating a new outbound screening investment regime, a new committee and a new bureaucracy to go with it. I tend to be a little shy of expanding government, and I wanted, if we need to do it, to make that decision based on facts and on a rational basis, and make sure that it is tailored to the problem we've defined. Here, I'm not sure we completely understand what we want to try and stop. I don't dispute that there is a national security risk that may need to be, the gap may need to be closed. And Mr. Ash, you can help me here, I think, in a second. But what my thought is to use something like what Mr. Barr is proposing, which is an expansion of the CMIC list, sort of a combination of the use of sanctions and export controls. It would be nimble, it would be precise, it would be clear to private actors what is in and out of scope. And but first, whether we go the committee route, and I've outlined a series of questions we really do need to answer before creating a new bureaucracy, or whether we go a sanctions route, we need to be very clear what it is, where the national security risk is, and that's, I think the intelligence community can help with that.
So you make note that the previous Congress and the Biden administration had considered creating a new government agency with very broad powers, and that would even oversee American firms and their allocation of resources and property and capital outside the United States, not just limited to China. And I believe your analysis of creating another bureaucracy with undefined and far-reaching powers, it certainly spoke to me and my constituents as an extreme version of overregulation and perhaps growth-stifling policies that could have a chilling effect on U.S. companies. So I'm wondering, you mentioned in your comments that CFIUS has some existing jurisdiction that could potentially be utilized here with the goals of regarding the threat of China through sanctions of Chinese military companies, modifying export restrictions, and building a comprehensive record of the risk gap. And I appreciated your line of questions there. I do hope that we will also take a look at things in the whole of Congress: espionage attempts, hacking attempts, attempts to steal U.S. technology, companies owned, debt held, land purchased, other national security threats by the PRC and the CCP. I'm wondering if you have any comments finally, and this could be directed at really any of the witnesses, Mr. Willems, Mr. Eshuk. Should we be concerned that outbound investment screening can go too far? And what are your comments on that?
Sure. The answer is yes, especially when you're discussing financial investments. One example from ECRA and FIRMA was this concern over risks presented by joint ventures between American companies and Chinese companies, and even that was a very expansive concept, blocking a particular kind of business transaction through the process, the legislative process that these committees went through. Came to the conclusion that it wasn't really about the joint venture, but rather what technology could be transferred. Mm-hmm. And I think that's what we need to do here. Is it just that an investment is outbound, or what's at the root of the concern? And then do we have the authority? And my bet is we probably do have the authority. We just need to tweak it a little bit.
Thank you. Mr. Williams, do you have any? You were nodding your head.
I agree it can go too far, and happy to elaborate in writing.
Thank you. My time has expired, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
The gentlewoman's time has expired. The gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Ogles, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In our first hearing, the House Financial Services Committee is highlighting the existential threat of China. In that vein, I'd like to thank the chairman and his leadership and my colleagues for their invaluable contributions, offering no less than 17 bills aimed at deterring CCP aggression. I'd also like to offer some observations and recommendations of my own. Currently, we are allowing the genocidal Chinese Communist Party access to trillions of dollars through our capital markets. Echoing Chair Luetkemeyer, we're directly subsidizing the CCP's military modernization and enabling its horrific human rights abuses. While we spend nearly $1 trillion on our own defense, we diminish that very investment as China uses revenues from our capital markets to flout the rule of law in the South China Sea. Case in point, the CCP was able to develop a brand new warship, the Fujian, because Beijing raised more than $8.6 billion back through 2015. So, Mr. Willems, looking at your written testimony and perhaps sanctions towards the CMIC, the Chinese Military Industrial Complex, what might you envision that we do as a Congress to prevent the United States from essentially building carriers and battleships that are being used against our allies?
So I think there are two things I would look at here. And the first is what you alluded to, which is the CMIC, making sure we are plugging all applicable gaps and we're covering all types of financing that can go to those military companies. So that's number one. The second one is on export controls. And export controls can be a tool to prevent our technology from going to China that can be used to support that exact same military development. Now, I think as I alluded to in my testimony, The way in which you do export controls, however, is critical. It can't just be the U.S. alone. It needs to be coordinated. Otherwise, other countries can step in and supply the same technology. So I would use both CMIC and export controls, but both of those tools need to be carefully coordinated with others.
Yes, sir. As a follow-up to the committee, as an economist, I look at the current state of China, and I see some economic vulnerabilities. And I think there's evidence to document that much of their economic data is actually fabricated. So as we look as a Congress, how do we go on offense and, quite frankly, take advantage of their economic weakness and assert America's dominance in the global marketplace?
So I think one thing that we could do more of and be better at is identifying vacuums before they manifest themselves. So in the case of Russia, I doubt Russia is going to be the same state sponsor of whatever around the globe that it has been. That's creating a vacuum. Venezuela is a good example. As we've seen, China's moved in. Well, the economic weaknesses you point out are limitations on China's ability to do that, and it's even more acute if the U.S. is there to meet them at that challenge. So I think anticipating where those gaps are going to be is wise policy for the U.S.
Beto, anyone else?
The other comment I would make on that, it's a great question, is, if that's the objective, then taking away the easy wins for them makes a lot of sense, right? So to your conversation earlier with Mr. Williams, if you're in a situation where they are able to secure financing for a wide range of civil military activities, taking away that avenue means that if they want to continue to maintain that pace of development and that pace of deployment, means that they'll have to find that money and those assets somewhere else, which makes it costlier and riskier for them to do so. So I think it's a twofold approach. It's identifying the vulnerabilities and then also plugging what we think of are the easy ways that they're able to access U.S. financial markets.
Well, look, I would just add that I completely agree with where you started with this, which is to say that their economy is probably not growing as fast as they want us to all think it is. They're more vulnerable, and there is a lot of division even within the Chinese Communist Party. Xi Jinping is not as secure in his position as many of us often think and has his own vulnerabilities at home. And so I just think through our intel community, through the way we do business, we need to recognize where those vulnerabilities are and exploit them. Because, again, China is not a monolithic state. They are more unstable than we actually realize. And I think trying to figure out where that instability is and putting a finger on it is good for the United States.
Mr. Chairman, I just want to thank the panel for being here. This has been a long day. You all are amazing and very much appreciated. Mr. Chairman, I yield my time.
Gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from Florida, Mr. Donalds, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Panel, yeah, long day. You guys been here a minute, man. I'll give you that. A couple things. Obviously, the economic issues, threat, however you want to categorize it, with China are extensive. And as a nation, we have a lot of work to do. A lot of work. One of those areas of focus of mine, and frankly for our country, should be in the energy space. As we've learned over the last year, it's critical that the U.S. really strengthens its domestic energy supply. And strengthening our energy supply is probably the biggest investment we can make in our economy. The second biggest, I would argue, largely comes out of this committee with financial regulation and the regulatory environment. On Thursday, I'm introducing legislation that is called the Protect American Energy from China Act. This legislation will prohibit federal funds from being used to implement a memorandum of understanding signed in 2011 by the Department of Energy and the Chinese Academies of Sciences. The MOU addresses the sharing of information, equipment, personnel, etc. Mr. Ashu, could you speak to the importance of protecting the integrity of the U.S. energy sector, why that's critical to our economy?
I can, Congressman. Thank you for the question. I don't think we've come near energy today, so this is an important one to touch upon. Speaking from an export control perspective, it's worthy to remind the committee that the Department of Energy is one of the regular members of the interagency that approves all licenses, and that is important for two reasons. One is there's a lot of fairly standard ideas around around energy, but there's a lot happening in the emerging space. And it's really critical that we get our licensing right, that we protect what we need to protect, and that we allow collaboration where it makes sense for American innovation. So in that respect, as a technology-driven industry sector, it's important that we get that balance right.
All right, no, I appreciate that, Mr. Fetto. I mean, you guys can all comment however you feel about it. It's kind of the free-for-all time of this committee. You can kind of do what you want. So if anybody else wanted to comment, I think you can go right ahead. That's fine.
I would just say our investment screening tool, CFIUS, frequently looks at energy-related investments to ensure the technology that Mr. Eshu referred to is protected and doesn't fall in the wrong hands.
I'm going to tackle this from a slightly different angle. I agree with my colleagues, and I think that there are, again, these restrictions and things that we need to put in place. But on the other hand, the other thing we need to be doing is unleashing American energy exports around the world. That is good for our economy. And so I do think that in addition to restricting where we need to restrict, we do need to think about where China is a market that can benefit our economy and take advantage of that. Because again, Chinese purchases of U.S. Products is subsidization for U.S. innovation.
Agreed. Real quick, Mr. Lorb, I got a question for you in particular. You know, obviously we have a lot of businesses that do a lot of very various things in China. What are some of the best ways you think that we can protect American businesses from, you know, covert espionage, the CCP, IP theft, and, you know, really weaponization against our businesses with shell companies here in the U.S.?
It's a great question. There are multiple sort of ways to think through it. Now, first and foremost, obviously companies have an obligation to protect themselves, or at least most of them do, right? But I think beyond that, there's a twofold answer to it. One is in situations where you think there is or is likely to be intellectual property theft or some type of corporate espionage, so on and so forth. U.S. government having the appropriate tools to say to the Chinese, that's not acceptable, and we will sanction you, will designate an entity or whatever it may be as a result. On the question, I think, which is a little bit different of the shell companies that you mentioned at the end, I mean, the States it is in sort of the mid-level stages of putting into place an effective and robust system to understand who is behind front-end shell companies that have registered in the United States. And once that is fully implemented, which should happen hopefully within the next year or two, I think that will be an equally impactful way to prevent exploitation of U.S. markets.
Well, expand on that thought a little bit. We're in the middle of the game and actually figuring out how to ferret this stuff out?
So, right. So, as was discussed, the Corporate Transparency Act and the Anti-Money Laundering Act were passed within the last 2 years. So, U.S. regulatory authorities are in process of rolling out the relevant rulemaking that's required under those pieces of legislation. So,
the gentleman's time has expired. The gentlewoman from Texas, Ms. De La Cruz, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you so much for holding this important hearing to combat the economic threat from China. And I would sincerely like to thank all the witnesses for being here. I know this is an all-day event, but your insight is very valuable to us. You know, today we're seeing heightened Chinese aggression on multiple fronts. And we just saw this week alone the Chinese balloon, which we have spoken about several times. It's critical that the Committee on Financial Services that were mobilized in our financial and oversight tools to address the China challenges. Later this month, I'm planning to introduce a bill to direct the Comptroller General of the United States to study the illicit financing associated with synthetic drug trafficking. As you know, I'm on the border in deep South Texas, so drug trafficking and China's involvement is very important to myself and to my district. You know, this study will outlay for Congress the business model that organizations are carrying out with the trafficking and how they move and hide illicit gains, and what the U.S. government can do better when it comes to fentanyl money laundering. So again, this is something near and dear and impactful for our district. So I'd like to ask you all if you all have any kind of clarity on the ties between the Mexican cartels and the Chinese Communist Party. If you've seen any ties, distinct ties, or know of any ties.
I'm happy to take the first cut at that question. It's obviously a very, very important one. And I know that starting really in 2017 during the Trump administration, the Treasury Department began looking very earnestly at illicit fentanyl trafficking generally, but specifically those networks and their touch points with jurisdictions, including China. In terms of specific ties, we have seen publicly reported information from the Treasury Department, as I was discussing with a colleague of yours, about Chinese companies that are making precursors to fentanyl and shipping those fentanyl products to Mexico, which are then finding their way across the border into the United States. So there is some limited information that's been public. With that being said, I do think a study commissioned to further explore that information is, the goal of getting that, I think, is a worthwhile endeavor. The other point I will make on it as well, and this is a conversation I was having with one of your colleagues, it's very important to have the relevant regulatory authorities in the United States publish as much information that is digestible by the private sector as they can in order to arm the private sector with that information to detect, disrupt, and deter such activity. So FinCEN, the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network at the Treasury Department, has done a really good job over the last few years of publishing in-depth guidance documents that are meant to tell financial institutions, this is the type of activity we're concerned about. This is the type of activity that you should focus on as financial institutions. And I think that's made a real impact. This would seem, if it's a priority, it seems like it absolutely is, to be a good candidate for that type of activity as well.
So what I'm hearing is that the GAO should make a first step in actually trying to find the flow of the money and stop the flow of the drugs and people across our borders. So a study you feel will be beneficial to the House.
I think that's right. I also do think that it would be very important to have Treasury work, not collaboratively, but sort of in parallel tracked, because I think that the Treasury Department will have access to additional information that the GAO may not have access to, which could be useful in providing information to the private sector to help disrupt and deter.
Thank you. I yield back.
The gentlewoman yields back. The chair now recognizes himself for 5 minutes. Thanks to the witnesses for being here today. I know it's been a long day, and I want to thank Chairman McHenry and Ranking Member Waters for holding this hearing. Mr. Fetto, you served as the first ever Assistant Secretary for Investment Security and oversaw the implementation of the Foreign Investment Risk Review Modernization Act, which passed on a strongly bipartisan basis. Can you please elaborate on the effectiveness of FIRMA in ensuring a welcoming investment climate while protecting our national security interests?
Sure. Thank you for the question. I think what makes that balance, the way the law has been drafted and the regulations have been implemented, it's got limited jurisdiction focused on specific things. For example, the control of a U.S. business by a foreign person gives jurisdiction, but the paradigm, the lens through which that is looked, scrutinized, is a national security lens exclusively. So, and there's a enumerated list of national security factors that the government considers on whether or not to clear a transaction. Similarly, with non-controlling jurisdiction, minority investments that give some level of influence or access over the U.S. business, it's been limited by the Congress to very specific areas, something related to collection and maintenance of sensitive personal data, the business relates to critical technology that's export controlled, or it relates to a company that utilizes or is involved with part of our country's critical infrastructure. And so because of the precision with which those areas of jurisdiction are defined in very clear rules, the private sector has very clear swim lanes on what is of concern and what isn't. Further, it's a voluntary process, so it gives some latitude to the private sector to understand there really is an open investment environment.
Thank you. So there's been some concern obviously raised over TikTok. However, similar concerning situations are present in our financial systems as well. Two prime examples of that, of broker-dealers that are subsidiaries of Chinese parent companies, are Webull and Moomoo. According to Webull CEO Anthony Denier, Webull is both a U.S. and Chinese company. Our technology team is based in Hunan, China, while all of our customer-facing and brokerage operations are New York City. That's a quote. The company also is partially owned by Xiaomi, a Chinese company whose consistent security concerns led to their temporary inclusion on a U.S. Department of Defense blacklist in 2021. Moomoo is owned by Futu Holdings, which has close ties to Tencent, a company with known ties to the CCP. Concerns about these companies have been echoed by others on the Hill, with these companies the focus of letters from Senator Cotton to the Director of National Intelligence, and from Senators Tuberville, Braun, Scott, and Marshall to the SEC chair. With millions of Americans using these apps, how concerned should we be about the potential for personally identifiable information or other user data to be shared with parent companies with strong ties to the CCP?
Very concerned. This is a data economy, and it's very clear what the PRC views about the importance of collecting as much information and as available and possible, and leveraging that for its own use and advantage. And so,
in the interest of time, just to that point, so if it's very concerning, what do you think should be done to address that in a meaningful way to protect the privacy of U.S. citizens and companies?
So if it's a CFIUS transaction, if it's one that's within jurisdiction, then that would be something that I think the committee would want to look at. And when I was at Treasury, I frequently got letters from members bringing to my attention transactions of concern. Some of them weren't within jurisdiction, but we very seriously considered every letter we received.
Thank you. The chairman's time has expired. I'd like to thank the witnesses on behalf of Chairman McHenry, Ranking Member Waters, and the members of this committee for their testimony today. I know it's been a long day. Without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days within which to submit additional written questions for the witnesses to the chair, which will be forwarded to the witnesses for their response. I ask our witnesses to please respond as promptly as you are able. And with that, much to your delight, this hearing is adjourned.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. Happy Monday.